So, welcome everybody. Welcome to our second star webinar of the 2019 college season. This one is to get us ready for regionals coming up this weekend, and also for any teams that have already qualified for D3 nationals, or people who just want to know a little bit more about playing with observers. So, again, my name is Tom Anowitz. I am the college division manager at USA Ultimate. Below me on the screen is Amy Hudson. Amy is the National Developmental College Coordinator. She helps plan the STAR webinars for me, and she also works with new teams and dev teams who are trying to get off the ground. So that's her role with USA Ultimate. And also, of course, we have the man of the hour. We have Mitch Dengler. And Mitch, I'll let you introduce yourself. For those of you who don't know, Mitch is the head observer at USA Ultimate. So, Mitch, if you want to get started.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for everybody for coming on. Hopefully I can give some useful information to everyone out there in USA Ultimate land. So my name is Mitch Dengler. As Tom said, I'm the National Observer Director, so I've been doing this for a couple of years now for USAU. I did one of these presentations last year, and we're hoping to keep doing these for before regionals every year, especially for people who haven't played with observers before, because sometimes, especially for some of the D3 teams, the first time they see observers is at regionals. So basically, I'm going to be going over the basic observer roles, going over the kind of what the active calls are for in-game and what the inactive calls are in arbitration. Actually, I'm not going to talk about a typical point with observers. We took that part out for this year. I forgot to update this slide. But anyways, we'll talk about the misconduct system, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you do have any questions as we go, type them in. Hopefully I'll see them as they go. If not, Tom or Amy will point them out to me. Just remember the primary question should be about focus on playing with observers, not like desired changes to the observer program. Certainly always open to feedback on that, but probably not in this venue. So observer roles. Basically, we're here to help players maintain spirit of the game. We have a small set of active calls, basically offsides, line calls, and time limits. And then we arbitrate disputed calls when we're asked, and we also implement the misconduct system. Things that are not observer roles. We don't actively call up down. We don't take control of game from the players. We don't decide the outcome of the game. We don't make subjective calls actively or render justice. We're not in charge of policing people's uniforms or policing the tournament format. If you have any tournament questions, ask your tournament director. They should have all your answers. Observers might know the answer and can be helpful sometimes, but we're not the go-to people there versus in-game stuff where we can be. So the key thing, though, is that the game still belongs to the players. Observers don't change that whatsoever. As I said earlier, active calls include offsides. So if you're the receiving team, just remember you have to be in contact with the goal line until the pull goes up. Once you've signaled readiness, and then the pulling team, you have to have both your feet completely behind the line until the pull is released. So those are pretty straightforward rules. We're going to signal it if there is offsides. We're going to signal it with two arms crossed over our heads, and we're going to yell offsides. You cannot decline offsides. We get that question all the time. Currently, the rules say you have to accept the offsides. The first instance is just a warning, and we'll have a repull. If both teams are offsides, then you'll have a repull. Subsequent violations by a team, basically if you're offsides on offense, which is rare, then you're going to start with the disc in the middle of your own end zone. If you're offsides on defense, which is more common, then the offense is going to start at midfield. Both of those penalties you basically set up like out of a timeout, and then the defense checks the disc in, and you start play from there. Other active calls are basically line calls, in and out of bounds. Basically, we're just going to, when you catch the disc near the sidelines, we're going to be giving one arm in or one arm out. We might, if the disc flies out of bounds and becomes out of bounds or rolls out of bounds, we might help mark where the disc goes out of bounds. We either like go put our foot on the line, or we drop an orange bean bag. More people are using that, but keep in mind that that's not a binding call. If an offensive player takes the disc and checks it in a different spot, that's not something that we will actively enforce. Say, no, you got to move it over here. If the defense sees that they checked it into the wrong spot and they want that call, they need to call that themselves. The observer's not going to actively call that. So a catch in the end zone. Once a catch has been claimed in the end zone, we're going to give the two arm in the end zone signal. Keep in mind this is not a goal, so this is not signaling a goal. So don't rush the field yet. Basically, the downfield observer is going to look around to make sure there weren't any calls like picks or fouls that would negate it. They're going to look back to the trail observer who might signal a travel or a stall or whatever. Until both observers are standing with both arms straight up, that's when a goal happens, and then go have fun and rush the field. So time limits are also active. This will be a pretty big difference between observed and unobserved games. It's going to move a little quicker in between points. The offense has 70 seconds to be on the line and signaling readiness. Key there is an early signal does not force an early by the offense does not force an early pull. Defense has 90 seconds to get the pull off, or 20 seconds from when the offense signals if the offense is late. The first time violation is a warning. Everything after that is basically a timeout. If you're out of timeouts, then it's treated like you're offsides. Very rarely are we enforcing this. It's not something that, teams are usually on time, and it's not something that we're, if you're 1 second late on the poll, we're not going to make a big deal out of it. We're more looking for, like, are you consistently 5 and 10 seconds late? Time limits. So once the pull goes off, once the disc hits the ground, or it hits the ground after a turnover, the offense has, if it's in the playing field proper, so inbounds and not in the end zone, you're going to have 10 seconds to put in play, and we're going to actively count that down. If it's in the end zone or out of bounds, or has gone out of bounds and come back in, we're going to give you 20 seconds to put that in play. If it's really, really far out of bounds, then we'll give you extra time based on our judgment. We're not going to put anybody in danger about like having to run across a concrete sidewalk in cleats or anything like that. The key here, though, is if the observer gets their pre-stall to 0, then if the defense wants, if they're within 3 meters of the thrower or where the disc is to be put in play, they can start the stall count.
So Mitch, just a quick question on that. So what does it look like when you're sort of counting out the pre-stall?
Basically, if a turn happens and it's inbounds, the observer is going to put one fist up in the air for this to signify 10 seconds, and then we'll start our arm chop. So basically 1 chop per second, and we'll give like 10, 5, and then 3, 2, 1 warnings, and then we'll probably point to the disc at 0 and say you may stall or disc in or something of that nature. Not everybody says the exact same thing, but usually that gets. Usually teams adjust to that pretty quickly. So it's pretty obvious if you see that arm chop, you're getting counted.
Fair enough. And do you ever have any issues with players not walking towards the disc or that kind of thing when you're observing games?
Every once in a while, and so basically there's a separate rule in the rules that's basically the 2-second delay call, and that is not an actively called rule by the observer. So that's on the defense to basically give that delay game warning, and then 2-1. And if the offense doesn't start trying to make an effort to put the disc in play in a reasonable manner, then they can start their stall. That's also a very commonly misapplied rule. So just make sure you know what you're doing with that rule, but also know that it's not an active call, so the observers aren't going to do that. We're just going to do the 10 and 20 second pre-stalls. So timeouts between points is also something we time, just like time between points. If you call a timeout between points, it just adds an extra 70 seconds between when you call that timeout. If you call it right after the goal is scored, or if you wait till like 69 seconds right before the offense is to signal, it doesn't change the total amount time given. So it doesn't matter when you call it in between points. You're still going to have offense is still going to have 140 seconds to signal readiness, and the defense is going to have 160 seconds to pull, which is basically just the normal time plus your 70 seconds. That's the timeout. Now, in my opinion, the single biggest difference between observed and non-observed game is timeouts during play. So the offense has the disc, they stop play with a timeout. we're going to establish what the stall is, and then we're going to start our clock for 70 seconds. So they basically have 70 seconds to be stationary. So at 40 seconds, we're going to start clearing off the sideline players that have come onto the field. At 50 seconds, we'll give a 20-second warning for the offense to set, and then they need to be set by 70 seconds. So that's going to be really quick versus what you're probably used to without observers. Without observers, that's probably closer to 3 minutes, I would say. Once the offense is frozen, the defense has 20 seconds to restart play, and then we'll give warnings to that as well. And then after that 20 seconds, if the defense doesn't start it, then either team can restart play after that. So inactive calls, basically any call that is not active is inactive. So it's pretty straightforward. So like foul, up, down, travel, stall, double team, pick, any of those that we don't call actively, which is almost every call, is player initiated. So players still make the calls themselves. We're not going to step in and make that call. If one of those is made and the call is contested, then any player involved in the call, so if like it's a foul, either the player that was fouled or the player that was accused of committing the foul, can request an observer ruling. Keep in mind that players should still try to work the call out themselves. They shouldn't just be like foul, contest, go to the observer. We're usually going to ask you like, hey, why don't you guys try to talk and reason your way through this, and maybe we can get to either a retracted call or an uncontested call. That's always much better resolution than an observer giving a ruling, and what we hope. But after 10 or 20 seconds, if the discussion isn't going anywhere, then the observer is going to say either play it as a contest and send it back, or ask us for a ruling, in which case we will provide one. We're not going to give a ruling unless we're 90% sure of what happens, and if we do give a ruling, all rulings are final. So please don't argue them after we give a ruling, and play will restart with a check. If a call is upheld, basically treat it as if the call was uncontested in terms of the rules. So possession, stall count, all of that. If the call is overruled, then treat it as if the call were retracted. If an observer is unsure what happened, then we're going to send the disc back and treat it just like it normally would with a contested call. And keep in mind that any call can be sent to the observer, whether it's like positioning after a pick, where the disc went out of bounds, a foul, double team, fast count, any of that. If we had a sure perspective of the outcome of the play, then we'll step in and give a ruling. Otherwise, we'll say, hey, we didn't see what happened. So,
so before you move on, Mitch, before we sort of move on to the signals, like it'd be kind of helpful to go through a couple of scenarios of inactive calls that sort of come up and can be a little tricky. We were thinking about a few before we all jumped on this webinar. So up-down calls can sometimes be tricky. Right? That's if I'm not mistaken, that's an inactive call, correct?
Correct. And that's probably the single biggest call that players think is active. So a lot of times you'll see like a player will make a really close catch in the end zone, and we'll give our two hands out signaling in the end zone. And all that means is a catch has been claimed in the end zone. It doesn't mean that we think the disc was up. If we see the disc skip clearly off the ground, player catches the disc in the end zone and says, yep, I caught that, we're going to signal in, even though we know it was down, because that's not our call. That's up to the defense to make that call. So I've seen where a player's laid out, caught the disc near the sideline. As they were standing up, they put the disc down, put their hand over the disc, and pushed themselves up to stand up, and then re-grasped the disc and stood up. And like all the sideline players were like looking at me like, why aren't you calling that disc down? And I didn't say anything. And after the point, I'm like, I didn't call that disc down because it's not my call. That's up to the defense to say that disc was down. I've also seen plays where like a defender will go up on a huck and catch the disc, come down with it cleanly, survive ground contact, and then look and they're like, hey, I'm in the end zone. I'm not a handler. I don't want the disc. And they just set the disc down and go to play offense. And I look around, and unless somebody on the defense says down, that just, he set the disc down, I'm not going to treat that as a turnover. So yeah, that's probably the most common one. I see there's a question about, is there a time limit on discussion between players about calls? There's not a set time limit, The general rule of thumb is we allow about 20 seconds of discussion if the observer feels that the discussion is going somewhere and is going to get someplace quickly, like they're just about to agree to something. We're not going to be like, hey, your 20 seconds is up. But if we, even after 10 seconds, the players are like, just like, no, that was a foul. Like, no, it wasn't. No, that was a foul. No, it wasn't. Well, that discussion's not going anywhere, and we're probably going to step in and say, either send it back or ask for a ruling. So about 20 seconds is a good rule of thumb there.
Cool. Yeah. So I have one more question for you. What happens if there are multiple calls? Like, how do you resolve that?
Okay, multiple calls. That's a great question, and that's something that isn't covered very clearly in the rules. So if there's like a, say, a throwing foul, and then there's a receiving foul, generally when you have multiple calls, you're going to want to resolve them in the opposite order they happened. So if there's a throwing foul, that happened first, and then there's a foul on the reception, that happened second. So you're going to resolve the second infraction first. So if there was, say the defense called foul on the catch and the offense caught it, well, okay, so if the defender's call is uncontested, you resolve that and you say, okay, that's the defender's disc, and then, okay, now we resolve the throwing foul, which is the earlier foul, and then we say, okay, the marker fouled the thrower, that's uncontested, so that's going to be the thrower, the disc is going to go back to the thrower. And so now, so we work backwards for possession, and then the stall count is, you kind of have to look at it as why is the disc coming back? The disc is coming back because of the throwing foul. So now throwing foul, that would be stall one with the thrower. So that's something that players aren't always aware of. It's kind of more advanced rule knowledge that isn't quite clear in this version of the rules. Hopefully we'll clean that up in the next version. Signaling, anytime an observer is asked for a ruling, when we give our ruling, the first thing we're going to do is touch our hands to our shoulders, and that's going to signify that the call that is coming is the observer's call. So it's not like an uncontested call. It's observer ruling, is then we'll say, okay, we're going to rule that a foul. So if we uphold the call, we're going to echo the hand signal for the particular foul, whether it's a pick, or the particular call, whether it's a pick or a foul or a travel. And then if we're going to overrule the call, we'll give observer ruling, and then we'll give one swipe for basically wiping away the call. So yeah, that's how arbitration is done and signaled. Common hand signals that players should know is basically 2 fists in the air up high is 20 seconds. 1 fist is 10 seconds. Pretty easy to remember, just 10 seconds per fist. And then the various calls, you have like your marking violation, you have tapping like a wristwatch is a counting violation for like fast count or starting a count too early. Stall or time violation is just patting your head. Travel is the standard travel from basketball. Pick is hand on shoulders that you can't quite see so well, just like that. Or hand on the hips, kind of like offsides in football. And then basically observer ruling, like I said, or an injury timeout. If there's an injury timeout, then we're going to stop play and say, hey, we got an injury timeout. If there's an injury substitution, we'll give the 2 fingers waving so that tells we have an injury substitution and that the other team can substitute as well. And then if there's a contested call, so if the resolution, if players call a foul, we're going to initially signal a foul, and then after they discuss, if they decide that they don't want to go to the observer and they just agree to play it as a contested foul, we're going to say, okay, we got a contested call, and we're going to send it back. Also, if the observer is asked for a ruling and they didn't have a good view of the play, so they're not 90% sure of what the call was, then we'll say, okay, tap the shoulders and give the contested signal, and that will notify that we're sending the disc back because we didn't have a good view of it. So
speaking of good view, Mitch, like what do observers look for? Like what are you looking for when you're like looking at a play and someone has come to you for a call, right?
That's a
like
great question.
what are you?
So most games are going to be observed by 2 observers. So you're going to have a downfield observer and a trail observer. Basically, the trail observer is the one that's going to be behind the thrower. That observer is primarily focused, probably like 95% of their attention is focused in on the thrower and the marker, because that's that's where, in that area, that's where the bulk of the calls are going to come from. So the observer there is looking for travels, fouls on the mark. They're looking for double teams. They're listening to the count to see if it's fast, fouls on the throw, all of that type of thing. So if you are having a call there at the thrower marker and you want an observer ruling, basically look back to the observer that's behind you. If you are calling a pick or a foul downfield, odds are it's that downfield observer. They're the ones watching all the cutters, looking for kind of blocking fouls, picks, other types of fouls downfield. So they're the ones they're gonna resolve most of like the receiving fouls and the picks. I see a question there. That's a good question down in the chat. It says if do both players have to agree to go to the observer, or whether only one player? So only one player involved. So if, say, the defender doesn't want to go to the observer on a receiving foul, but the receiver does, if the receiver says, after they've talked it out and they say nope, the receiver says I want to go to the observer, then the observer is going to go ahead and give a ruling, even if the defender doesn't want to go to the observer. So it just has to be a player that's involved in the call. It can't just be like, well, there's a foul and a contest. It can't be like, oh, the captain away from the play says, no, I want an observer ruling. Well, they weren't involved in the play, so they can't ask for that. So misconduct foul. This is kind of a busy slide. I kind of put this together because it's a nice little quick reference sheet for the misconduct system. Basically, there are 4 components of the misconduct system. You have technical fouls, which are just basically the exploding T. It's kind of basically things that affect the presentation of the game. So you're gonna have like rushing the field too early, players being too close to the sidelines that aren't playing, or kind of like general profanity if there are rules for a specific tournament governing language. And then you have the misconduct fouls, which are more of things that affect the actual gameplay. So you have your team misconduct foul, which are your blue cards, which are basically like profanity towards an observer or an opponent, general reckless play, repeated violations, or a particular egregious instance of a single violation, taunting, spiking a disc towards an opponent but not contacting them, unintentionally spiking the disc and kind of accidentally contacting an opponent. If you kind of like flip the disc back and the wind takes it and it goes over and brushes against your opponent, we're just gonna like, hey, that's total accident. We're not gonna do anything. But just a good rule of thumb is look before you spike. Try to be careful with the disc there, because it's a lot of times it's an easy way to get a miscommunication between players, and you start getting kind of contentiousness where it wasn't intended. I'll take a quick sip here. So you also have personal misconduct fouls. Those are kind of more severe instances of what's going on with the team misconduct fouls. So particularly egregious profanity towards an observer or opponent, excessively dangerous play, very like biting into people's legs, continued repetitive violations by a single player, shoving a player. All of those can be yellow cards. Keep in mind that 2 yellow cards on a single player in one game is an ejection for 2 halves. So if it happens in the first half, you're done for the rest of the game. If your second one happens in the second half, you're going to be done for the rest of that game and the first half of your next game. So very, very rare. We very rarely have to deal with that. And then also we have straight ejection. So if you intentionally spike a disc, like trying to hit a player, and you do, then we'll throw you out of the game straight away for that. Obviously, throwing a punch, kind of doing some like shoving a player during play, like not trying to play ultimate whatsoever. Yeah, I mean we can straight eject you for that. Again, very, very, very rare thing, and it's not something observers want to do. It's not like we're itching to pull the trigger on any of this stuff. We just want to sit back and watch great ultimate and handle things as they happen. But it's certainly not. There's no contest of like who can get the most blue cards or who can get the first ejection or anything like that. That's anything could be further from the truth. So in terms of implementation, basically the technical fouls and team misconduct fouls fall into separate buckets. and then 3 of any one type is a yardage penalty. So if you have 3 technical fouls or 3 team misconduct fouls, then your team's going to be issued a yardage penalty. So basically, if it's against the defense, then the offense gets to either set up at the attacking brick or just set up in the middle of the field from where they are. Say if they're closer to the goal line than the attacking brick, we're not going to move them backwards. Or they can just choose to stay in the current position. You know, they might have a player wide open in the end zone and they don't want the defense to be able to match up. So all 3 of those instances, play will start with a new stall. If the disc is moved, then basically teams set up like coming out of a timeout. If it's against the offense, then it's going the other way. So you set up at the offense sets up at the reverse brick, and you'll have a new stall. Or the defense can say, no, we want to keep him in the same position, and you'll stay with the current stall. Keep in mind that personal misconduct fouls and ejections also count as TMFs. So in terms of your bucket for your 3 TMFs, that's kind of how that works. So if a team has a TMF and then one of their players gets a yellow card, then they're going to have basically 2 TMFs, one from the first TMF, one from the yellow card. So, and remember that they are separate buckets. So if you have 2 technicals and then a team also gets a team misconduct foul, that's 2 and 1. That's not a total of 3. So,
I mean, so Mitch, it's pretty easy to avoid cards, though. I mean, isn't it?
oh yeah, I mean, just abide by spirit of the game. Don't treat players how you would want to be treated yourself, and things are going to work out. I mean, we understand that sometimes, I mean, most often dangerous play is not intentional. Like a lot of, I mean, almost every player I've ever given a blue or a yellow card for dangerous play, they're usually looking at me going, I didn't mean to do that, and I'm like, I totally believe you. I totally believe you didn't try to take out that player's legs, but you did. So intention has very little to do with it. Usually, if we can discern intention, like usually that's when we're going to get into yellow and red. So carding players, keep in mind that observers will not stop active play to issue a blue card. So if a marker is like constantly bumping on the mark and it's something that's been called, and like if a thrower is constantly calling contact, like play continues. We're not going to step in and say, whoa, stop, and issue a TMF. We're going to let play continue, and once we've decided to issue a blue card, then we're going to wait for the next stoppage. Maybe we make that decision at a stoppage, so it's just kind of a natural spot. But sometimes there will be a call, and we're like, yep, or there's an instance of something, and we're like, yeah, okay, I'm going to issue a blue card, but play's going to continue. There might be 3 or 4 turnovers before the next stoppage, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, and this is a big thing that I'd really like to stress, is players should be making calls and communicating problems to their opponents before coming to us and saying, hey, they're bumping on the mark too much. And we're like, well, are you calling the foul? Are you calling contact? Have you talked to them about it? If they haven't, then we say the first thing they should do is like make the call, talk to your opponent, try to get them to stop, because they might not realize they're doing it. But yeah, if they keep doing that, then we certainly would issue a card if it was problematic. We're not going to just like, hey, they're bumping on the mark just a little bit, and then issue cards without any sort of call preceding that. Now, if the infractions are particularly egregious, like say, stall 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's a crazy fast count. So even if that's not getting called, you're starting to get away from really getting away from the rules of ultimate really far. So you're starting to make it not ultimate. So we do have the ability to give out cards when players aren't making calls about it, but that's going to be pretty rare. The infractions are going to be pretty egregious at that point. So now for PMFs or yellow cards, we will stop active play for that, because usually it's going to involve some sort of unsafe or dangerous condition. Most often play is already stopped. I think I've only stopped play for a yellow card once in all my games. So usually it's after a pretty hard foul where somebody's on the ground, or something crazy happened and tensions are high and players are already starting to have a problem with one another. But keep in mind that if we see like a particularly bad bid, we can stop play. So Something I've thrown in here, I don't want to go over it, but one of our observers, Brian Bradford, made these great two-sided cards that kind of give a very quick reference about playing with observers. So he's got a front side and a back side, and it kind of has some of the ins and outs of playing with observers. Some of them apply to college ultimate, like some of them don't, like gender ratio. Right now, we're not going to have that at college nationals, obviously, but it's got a lot of great things, and they make like great cards to hand out. So hopefully I'll have made a couple of these for handing out at college nationals or whatever. But that's all the prepared content I have. So hopefully players find that helpful. If you have any questions whatsoever right now, this is a great time to ask, and I'm happy to answer anybody's questions.
While the participants are sort of thinking of any questions that they might have, and use this time, hopefully, if you can think of some. Mitch definitely wants to volunteer his time and answer anything he can. But while people are thinking, I have just a quick question. Can you sort of like talk through the different versions of sort of an uncontested foul in the end zone? So something that could result in a goal, or could result being taken out at the goal line.
Okay, yeah. So basically, if you have a throw that kind of goes up in the end zone and say the defender fouls the receiver and the receiver never caught the disc and they call foul, if the call is uncontested or if they go to the observer and the observer upholds the call, keep in mind that according to the receiving foul rule, the possession is awarded to the fouled player at the spot of the foul. So a common misconception is like, oh, the offense it's uncontested or it's upheld. The players like want to check the disc in at the goal line. Well, no, if it's 10 yards deep in the end zone, play's going to start 10 yards deep in the end zone with the defensive check, and then the offensive player with disc in hand is going to have 20 seconds to get to the goal line and then ground tap the disc and put it in play. So it doesn't automatically start at the goal line. If the foul is if the receiver catches the disc and then is fouled and say they land awkward because of the contact, even if the defender didn't touch the disc at all, but the player who's caught the disc established possession and then lands awkwardly because of the foul loses possession of the disc. If they tell us like, hey, not only was I fouled, I caught the disc, then even though it wasn't a strip by the letter of the law of a strip, if you look at the scoring section, it says a player who possessed the disc and first point of contact would have been would have been in the end zone. If it's uncontested, then that's a score. So that's important to distinguish there. So if you're fouled, call foul. But if you also think you had possession, go ahead and you should also make the point that, hey, I also had possession. So, and then obviously if it's contested, it's going to go back to the thrower. Or if the defensive player calls a receiving foul, if that's upheld or if it's uncontested, that doesn't go back to the thrower. That's actually the defender's disc in hand, and they now become it's their disc on offense. So let's see here if I can go up through some of the.
We had one from Matt.
Kind of
which
cards,
says,
calls, whatever from the observers can players overrule? That's a great question. So basically, a player can overrule an observer's active call or a card, but only to their detriment. So if an offensive player catches the disc inbounds and the observer calls them out, they can't look at the observer and go, "I overrule you. I was in bounds." That's the observer's call. That's not the offensive player can't overrule a player to their advantage. But the defensive player can say, no, I disagree. I think he was in. I think she was in. So they can overrule a call to their detriment. So obviously the defense, if the offensive player was ruled out, it would be the defense's disc. But the defense can say, no, that wasn't a turnover. They were in bounds. I'm going to overrule the observer. They can also do that on cards. Pretty much on a line call, we're always going to let a player overrule the observer. On a card, we're usually going to let a player overrule an observer unless unless it was like, say, dangerous play and it was clearly dangerous play, we're not going to let teams just to agree to play dangerously. So it's like, yeah, bid through my legs all you want, and I can bid through your legs. Like, no, we're not going to let teams agree to that. In terms of yardage penalties, teams are free to decline a yardage penalty if they don't want that aspect of the game entering in. That's fine, and 99% of the time we're going to let them do that. One place where we won't let them do that is if teams, like, say, want to agree to not have the swearing penalties enforced at college nationals. Well, that's a USAU policy, and we're not going to let teams agree to get around a policy that they don't agree with. So yeah. Let's see here. What else we got? Can you explain how observers rule strips versus fouls based on what is described by the players? Another great question. So basically, according to the rules, a strip is once an offensive player has established possession, or once a receiver has established possession, if the opponent hits the disc, makes contact with the disc, and knocks the disc out of their hand or out of control of that player, then that's a strip. It's a very specific subset of fouls. So if a player calls strip, they are claiming possession. Now, if a player calls strip and they describe really only a foul in terms of like, hey, I caught the disc, and then the player hit my arm, that's not technically a strip because they didn't hit the disc, they hit the arm. But if they're describing hitting the arm, then really what they're describing is a foul, and so we're going to rule it based on a foul. But if you call strip and all you ever describe is strip, and we as observers feel you never have possession, we're going to overrule that strip. So a great rule of thumb is don't call strip, call foul, and then say, I also had possession, and then describe the contact as you see. So I hope I described that well. Let's see here. If a player gets injured, does an observer stop play? So that's a kind of a tricky situation. So if a player is injured and they still have the ability to call injury in terms of like they're not screaming in pain, they're not writhing uncontrollably, then we're going to let the player decide whether they want to play on or call injury. We're not going to call that for them. Now, if a player gets knocked out, or if a player obviously breaks their arm or breaks their leg and they're just screaming in pain, we're going to stop play because that's an unsafe situation. But there might be a time where a player sprains their ankle, goes down, holds their ankle, but they're watching play because their team is about to score. If they want to choose to play on, they can do that. Keep in mind that as an opponent cannot call injury for the other team. If say the offense has an injured player, the defense can't call injury for them. Now, if it's obviously an unsafe condition, they should call like a technical timeout, or the observer might, if there's an observer present, they can certainly step in there. But generally, if you're not sure, like let the player decide whether to play on, because if you're ever unsure and then the player calls injury, if they haven't continued playing, the call is going to be retroactive to the injury. So whether like a goal is scored or a turnover is thrown, if the injury was before any throwing motion and ultimately an injury is called, then it's going to go back to that time. So, but yeah, in general, observers overall are not going to stop active play unless there's like an unsafe condition, like a dog runs out on the field or a little kid runs out in the field and they're going to get hit by the disc or hit by a player or something like that. So, let's see, do we have any other questions?
Any other questions at all? But I guess, if anyone can think of some questions, now is the time. I have one last thing that came up that Amy and I were talking about sort of before we jumped on. When you start the play off a pull and somebody goes and tries to pick up the disc, there are sort of in order to think of a number of things that happen. Amy was talking about her experience where there was a turnover once when the disc was she was trying to. Amy, can you explain? Actually, it's probably better if you explain what exactly happened.
Yeah. So I was the fielding player. So the pull went out of bounds. I knew that I didn't want to put it in bounds, but I ran out of bounds and got the disc and threw it to my teammate and she didn't catch it, and just to let her tap it in. And Mitch was explaining to me why it was a turnover.
Yeah, so basically if once Amy picks up the disc and possesses it, she's now the thrower. And even if she picks up the disc out of bounds and throws it, she's made a throw. So if she throws it to her center handler and it's short and it hits the ground, then that's obviously a turnover because the disc has hit the ground after being possessed, and the disc is live, but it's not in play. So it's still subject to a turn if it's dropped, and in this case, the thrown to the ground is basically the same as a drop. Now, keep in mind also that if her teammate were to have caught it, that would be an illegal throw in terms of a travel because she didn't bring it to the appropriate spot on the field if she threw it from out of bounds. So it wouldn't be a turnover, but it certainly could be called a travel. All of those would not be active calls by the observer because it's not a line call. It's not in or out of bounds. It's basically up down. So up down's not an active call. So if she threw it to her center handler and it landed at her center handler's feet, and the center handler picked up the disc and tapped it in at the brick mark, and nobody on the defense said anything, the observers would just watch it happen and let it go because that's not our call. We see players agree to things that are not in their best interest or not they're not obeying the rules to the letter of the law, sometimes not even close. We see that happen all the time, and if it's not an active call, we're not going to step in and make a call. So, but yeah, it's a really good idea. If the disc is live and you pick the disc up, don't put the disc down, and don't hand the disc off. If she were to run to the center of the field and hand the disc to her center handler, if you look at the turnover section, basically handing a disc to another player that's live is also a turnover. So if she threw it to her, just walked up to her a foot away and threw it to her teammate, and her teammate caught it, that's basically a travel, but it's not a turnover. If she hands it to her, then that's a turnover. Or if she throws it to her and it hits the ground, then that's a turnover. So lots of little nuances.
I hate reliving this.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So many regrets.
Let's see here. Can a team get penalized for the actions of its spectators, such as touching a disc out of bounds? That's a good question. In general, so the short answer is yes. They technically can get misconduct fouls for the actions of their spectators. Basically, if you look at the text of the misconduct system, it says for the purposes of misconduct, a player is defined as any of the rostered players on the team, the coaches and support staff, and supporters. So like basically fans. Now, especially at a tournament like Nationals where you have a ton of tournament staff, if there's say your fans are being really unreasonably abusive in heckling the other team, basically what we're going to do is we're going to just go over and ask them to stop and be positive in their heckling. Everybody wants to have fun, but keep it nice. While we can issue misconduct fouls for that, we're generally going to go over and ask the scorekeeper to bring over a USAU rep and let the USAU rep handle that without having any sort of impact on the game. In terms of touching a disc out of bounds, like if the disc is going out of bounds, like I say, it's gone out of bounds on a swing pass, and there's no chance that it could have come back in bounds, and a spectator just hits the disc down and throws it back to the line, that's perfectly fine. We would not. That's not a problem whatsoever. Obviously, the spectators need to be behind the spectator line. Every field at Nationals will be surrounded by spectator lines. Regionals will not be the case. Just like there won't be a ton of support staff at regionals to handle unruly hecklers. Obviously, if a disc is out of bounds, but it's trailing back in bounds, we want to make sure we let those discs go. Teams can certainly call obstruction. There are rules handling that that aren't always the clearest rules, but they can certainly call that because that certainly interferes, especially if it interfered with the player's ability to catch the disc that they quite clearly could have caught. I hope that answers the question. So,
anyone have any other questions? Anything at all? Well, Mitch, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. That was really informative. If anyone else has any other questions, shoot me an email and I can get them to Mitch after the fact. I'll also be sending out the slides. This was recorded, and if you want to send it along to team members, hopefully we'll get it out online pretty soon. But other than that, I just want to say thank you again, and we'll talk to you all soon and see you on the field.
Yeah, good luck to everybody playing. Looks like we have some person typing a question if we want to wait for that. But yeah, while we're